I'm going to get going since it's 3 minutes after, and we've had lots of people watching on the recording as well. So we will get started. So this is the fourth edition of our We Can't Police Our Way Out of a Pandemic ongoing dialogue, which we've been having over the past couple months. I'm coming to you from the traditional and still unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation, which is known as Ottawa, or by some people as Ottawa, in Ontario in Canada. My name is Alex McClelland, and I'm a first-generation settler from England, and on one side of my family, and a fifth-generation settler from Scotland and Ireland on the other side of my family. I'm a longtime AIDS activist and a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Ottawa in the Department of Criminology, and an incoming assistant professor at the Institute of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Carleton University. And so today I'm super excited. We have a range of very fascinating, amazing speakers from all over the world, including South Africa, Ireland, and the US. And I think our next dialogue is slated from a month from now. We don't have the exact date yet set, but if you're interested in remaining involved and getting connected to that, you can email policingthepandemic@gmail.com. And thank you to Aziz, Katerina, Jane, and Colin for coordinating our session today. This has been really helpful with them. So this has been a dialogue space for us to advance ideas about the rise of policing in the context of COVID and the rise of authoritarianism, always with a vision for abolition of police and prisons. It's been an open kind of concept dialogue to share ideas, updates from the ground, and to put into question public health collaborations with police and strategize for action. In terms of logistics, keep your microphones muted. If you have any questions, put them in the moderator box or put them in the chat box, and we have Aziz, Colin, and Kat who will be moderating to assist with that. And this event is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube shortly after, probably tomorrow. And so you can share it around afterwards that way. And we will also share it on our website. We have a new website called wecan'tpolicethepandemic.ca, which has the past dialogues on it as well. And so two kind of quick things or shout outs. Meenakshi Mano from Pivotal Legal Society posted, I'll just put it in the chat, posted a really great op-ed yesterday, who works at Pivotal Legal Society. She spoke at the last dialogue, and she talked about the ongoing police harassment in BC, where they haven't been ticketing people like they have in other provinces of Canada, but they have been harassing people at an increased level. And so that's a useful analysis. Also, Katerina, Samantha McLeese, and myself also released a blog post looking at alternatives to policing in Ottawa in Canada, and I'll post that here too. So let's get into the talks because we have quite a few speakers, and we'll get going with that. So, oh wait, actually, sorry, I forgot. We have one more update. A bunch of people who have been mobilized because of these dialogues have been working on creating a statement on calling for the halting of COVID sharing, healthcare data sharing with police. And there's a number of calls for action coming from that. I guess myself and Gary will talk about it. I'll just let Gary chime in for a second, and I'll kind of respond with anything else. We wanted to update everyone on this call and kind of ask people if they wanted more information about it.
Okay, so as Gary Kinsman speaking to you from the territories of the Tikamishiq Anishinaabe people. Some people refer to it as Sudbury, and it also is the territory of other Anishinaabe people. So a number of us, as Alex was saying, have got together as sort of a working group of this broader You Can't Police Your Way Out of a Pandemic group. So beyond just having discussions and supporting each other, we also are trying to develop activities in common. So we've put together a common statement opposing police access to any information on the COVID-19 status and other information that people might have. And we know the police are able to get this legally in Ontario right now. So one of the things we're calling for is the ending of that section of the emergency legislation, but we're also calling for people to not give information to the police and for people to not design apps or other technological means that would allow the police to have this type of information, because we know exactly how the police are using this information against people. So we have produced an open letter, which includes a series of calls to action, and I'm hoping that someone will put the connecting points for this into the chat box now so that people who haven't seen it can actually look at it. There's an open letter that organizations and individuals will be signing on to, as well as a background information statement that are going out together. It's been prepared by a number of people, including Anne, Sana, Liam, Alex, others. I've had a little bit to do with it. The initial signers include organizations like in Ottawa, the Coalition Against More Surveillance, the Toronto Overdose Prevention Society, OCAP, the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, No One is Illegal in Toronto, Parkdale Community Legal Services. I'm sure that other organizations have also signed on to it. The plan is to release it publicly, hopefully early next week, with these initial signers on it, and to at the same time send out a media release announcing that we're doing this, and then to try to get as many people, organizations in particular, but also individuals, to sign on to it. Then after that, it will be delivered to the particular people whose names are at the top of the letter. And what we would really like from all of you is for you to be able to circulate this, to talk it up, and to sign on to it, to get your organizations to sign on to it. We really want to make this as effective as possible as an intervention against what the police are doing in terms of the way in which they're using this information against people right now. I think that's all I'll say for now. Alex might have something to add.
Thanks, Gary. That's great. Yeah, I don't think we can't share the call yet because I think Anne was still editing parts of it, but I'll just kind of give people an overview of what the calls for action were. So I won't share the text in the chat box yet. There's 7 calls to action. One of them is that the province revoke the order enabling the police access to sensitive health information. One of the calls was to call on the TTC, the Toronto Transit Commission, Canada's largest public metro system, who had released someone's COVID positive status and their data, denying them access to the service, asking them to apologize, asking the government to repeal that section of the law, asking it for it to include a sunset clause if they don't repeal it, because I don't think they will. And then there's also calls to healthcare workers and custodians of healthcare data to not release it, and calls to IT workers and designers and programmers to not build and design the technology. Those are more like rhetorical to get conversation going about that. But just so that people on this call know, that will be going out next week, and we're going to be asking for signatories. So please, if you're in Ontario specifically, it would be great to have your organization or you be part of that. So thank you, Gary. I will now move on to pass it over to Yavar Hameed, who is a human rights lawyer based in Ottawa, and his practice includes complaints to human rights tribunals, charter litigation, prisoners' rights, and national security law. Welcome, Yavar.
Thank you so much, Alex. It's an honor and privilege to be part of this discussion. I'm coming to you from unceded Algonquin territory. Eid Mubarak to anyone celebrating Eid today, or it may be tomorrow for others. I want to talk about sort of three concepts or 3 topics under what I would sort of refer to as a human rights new normal, coming out of the pandemic, or in a transitionary period from the pandemic. There's so much discussion, and this is sort of through the lens of a legal analysis, using legal instruments for social change. But my observation, and also my concern about what so many of us have witnessed, talked about, and written about, is that traditional structures don't work. And certainly we can say this about jails, we can say this about prisons, but we can also say about traditional legal structures. And the 3 points that I want to raise in terms of what kind of legal tools that we have available to us and we've used in over many years. One is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Second is the legal apparatus of a migrant detention, and then generally about incarceration and criminal incarceration generally. So those are the 3 things that I want to talk about. So first of all, in terms of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, in charter litigation and using equality as a basis for advancing social struggles, I think what we've seen time and time again is, and we know this, is that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was created as a negative rights instrument. It's to protect essentially individual civil liberties. And so much of what we see, and this is not wrong, we have a discussion about the protection of civil liberties in a time of crisis, in a time of the pandemic. But what we're seeing revealed is the very foundation of that system, based on a notion that everyone can benefit from those civil liberties. That is something that we're just seeing exploded. And we see it across the world, globally. We see it certainly markedly in the United States, but no less here in Canada, where the asymmetries in terms of whether people have access to housing, shelter, whether they're living on the street or street involved, you can't benefit from rights protections if you don't have basic human needs. And one of the most basic of those is shelter. And so I think what we're seeing, and this is a favorable and a positive thing, we're seeing in respect of, at least in Ontario, a moratorium on evictions in certain contexts, and the litigation which happens before the rental housing tribunals has to become alive to what is increasingly a problem of insecurity in people being able to access just the money to live, and using the money to live actually, rather than towards shelter. And so in some of the most basic ways, when we think about racial discrimination and all forms of discrimination, protection from state intervention is really important, but must occur from this common denominator of having basic economic and social protections. And so I think that protections for people living precariously needs to be enhanced, and what we should be seeing, and this is both I think a pragmatic shift that has to happen, and one increasingly that we should be seeing in the world of using legal instruments like the Charter, is to bring poverty as a ground of discrimination in itself, to be something that we can contest. Now, whether that's done directly through sections of the Charter, Section 15 of the Charter, or whether it's done implicitly, in the sense that we have to predicate all forms of human rights struggles on the protection of basic human needs first. So secondly, a concern with respect to detention that's used in the context of incarceration of migrants. And I think a really important kind of paradox in what we're facing now is this increased insecurity of everyone. And I'm going to talk about what this means to me for prison abolition and decarceration. But the practice of migrant detention is something that is that's normalized. It's just something that happens as a matter of course. And I think that we've within immigration systems, there's an idea that we fight the fights that we can fight, but the immigration law recognizes that preventive detention on the basis that someone may be a flight risk or danger is something that's normal and appropriate. But now with the flip of recognizing I won't say the inherent discrimination and precarity of people living in prisons, but what COVID-19 has done is it's shined a spotlight on one aspect of that precarity. And I think that there's a moment here where looking at all forms of detention, it can be and should be something that we need to reassess and reevaluate. So the networks that exist, certainly the people, many of the people who are watching this in terms of ending immigration detention, that's something that's been talked about for many years. But I think that there's this moment for normalization of bringing that idea of the unsustainability of migrant detention to something that we can really put into the mainstream discourse in immigration law and in immigration struggles. And in terms of some of the historical work that I've done, where on the one hand, whether it's in the context of national security and immigration security certificates, there's been a movement about abolition of these politicized forms of immigration detention, but it's sort of always in tandem with the legal fights that we have to fight within this very circumscribed box. And I think that what we need to reimagine and rethink, and I think that we're forced to do this, certainly within our legal realm, is with the unsustainability of the carceral system for migrants. What we're seeing, the alternatives have to be put forward as a priority within that context. So then the last point, generally, because I know that part of this discussion from different perspectives is talking about prison abolition. Decarceration is something which I know from some of my clients and people who are inside and detained at this moment, is something that's real. It's not something, unfortunately, that's available to everyone, because the legal tests with respect to bail review, and I can say this of the Ottawa jurisdiction, is one in which COVID-19 is being recognized by Crown Counsel to be a factor that should be militating towards release, and that's recognized. It's not being refuted, but it's not something that automatically will allow for release. But be that as it may, I think that the fact that this discussion is even happening, that bail reviews across the board for incarcerated persons is something that is normative. It's being something that is being pressed forward in this moment where in Ontario and across Canada, because of emergency orders, no courts or tribunals are moving forward with normal kind of work. So the idea that legal structures can actually work to I don't want to say erode the prison system, but reimagine and be forced into a position where decarceration is a priority. In terms of an obstacle of where that may come, we don't know what's going to happen down the line, where things become reweighed, and where there's sort of perhaps a pendulum shift backwards. But certainly where this momentum exists in this moment right now, there is opportunity to bring in, with different struggles that are, exercising around prison abolition, to feed that into the legal momentum that's being used for the liberation of prisoners. And perhaps my last comment on this, and this sort of dovetails with my initial comment, is where, decarceration as, a legal phenomenon, something that, has the judicial stamp of approval, is something that is, that's working. It can work. It's a consequence of, formalized legal process. It, in a sense, in and of itself, delegitimizes what for so many years outside of that pandemic structures, people were just taking for granted. So in many ways, for me, my contribution to this is that so much of the human rights discourse has been about a very small piece of the kinds of rights that we can protect. And I think that there is really this moment where social struggle, lived experience, and the kind of activation on the ground, that kind of real connection of movements can become a basis for changing the way that we conceptualize the protection of human rights.
Thank you, Yavar. So I have one question. We have a lot of speakers, so I'll just ask one question. This is from someone who sent it into the chat to one of the moderators. If I'm understanding correctly, suggesting that in this moment we're seeing a broader reevaluation and reimagining of detention and incarceration. And it's a moment where we can bring abolitionist ideas into the mainstream. Are you aware of any models where groups that have used this kind of, or are aware of any models or groups that have used this kind of momentum? And what would it look like to mobilize the momentum beyond COVID?
Right. I'm not specifically aware of models or groups that have done this. I guess my only comment would be that to me it's a remarkable phenomenon in the sense that yeah, I guess one part of it is what would this look like? In part, it's like it's what we're seeing now. We're seeing incrementally the fact that decarceration is happening as a phenomenon, and so the potential is there, and I think it's happening right now. The networks that we have right now are not marginal. They're speaking to a discussion that's happening right now. So I think part of it, and I can say certainly to the fact that I'm alive to that. Like I don't primarily practice in the area of criminal law, but I think using and exercising where links are with legal advocates, lawyers, and people within those structures to talk about what we've always known. And so in a sense, I'm not talking about reimagining anything different than abolitionists have been talking about for years and years, but it's the awakening, by necessity of legal practitioners and the judicial system of being open to that.
Cool, thank you so much. For anyone else, if you have questions, we'll also do rounds of questions at the end. Thank you, Yavar. So now I'm going to pass it on to Ciara Bracken-Roche, who is an assistant professor of criminology in the Department of Law at Maynooth University in Ireland and a visiting professor at the Department of Criminology in the University of Ottawa. Her research program investigates the role and impact of surveillance technologies in the rapid expansion of security, policing, and commercial surveillance in Canada and Ireland. And we've never met in person, but me and Ciara shared, I took over Ciara's office, and she has excellent taste in posters as well.
Yeah, I'm glad someone else was able to benefit from it. Because we haven't met in person, you don't know how to pronounce my name either, unfortunately.
I don't, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay, don't worry. In Ireland, everybody knows how to say it, of course. It's Ciara, like K-I-R-A.
Ciara. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, that's okay. Not at all. Yeah, so I'm Ciara Bracken-Roche. I'm at Maynooth University now in Ireland. I just started in the department in December, having recently left the University of Ottawa. So I think what I'm going to talk to you all about today, Kat asked me to speak to some of the kind of surveillance pandemic related things that are coming up in Ireland. So this might be a little bit more summary like, just to kind of introduce you to the various measures that we're seeing here. And I've written a bunch of notes to kind of make sure that I'm covering everything, but feel free to, kind of pick up on things that I might have missed or questions that you might have. So I'm a surveillance studies scholar. So let's start off by kind of thinking about what surveillance means. So David Lyon has a pretty widely accepted definition of surveillance. And what we say with that definition is that surveillance is the focused, routinized, and systematic attention to detail for the purposes of influence, management, or direction or control. It's also something that is discussed in the field that surveillance is Janus-faced. So it can be used for good, but often, maybe more often than not, it is used for bad. It's used to target particular populations. So I'm just going to leave that kind of academic definition there and let me go back to the Irish case. So in Ireland, we had universities and schools shut down on March 11th. So I think about a week ahead of Canada and right before the kind of WHO announced the kind of official pandemic release or statement. And the Department of Health in Ireland are kind of the primary agency dealing with the country's responses to COVID-19. There is a special group with the National Public Health Emergency Team who are looking at COVID-19. They were kind of founded at the end of January. And emergency measures have been brought into place in response to the pandemic. So additional powers for the police service here, as well as kind of slightly more extreme measures have been introduced in Canada. So for example, at the end of March, a 2-kilometer lockdown limited people kind of to the area around their homes or immediate dwelling, unless they were going out for groceries or to medical appointments. And the extension of the police powers happened at the kind of the beginning of April. They came active on April 8th, and that was ahead of the Easter weekend. So in Ireland, still being kind of a predominantly Catholic country, people were planning to travel for Easter. And so there was kind of a big initiatives by the police here to kind of lock down and keep people restricted to their immediate area. So in Ireland, the police are called An Garda Síochána, or the Gardaí, and their emergency powers were introduced at the beginning of April. And since April 8th, we've seen these kind of emergency powers be used 241 times, or on 241 occasions. And the 5 powers that were kind of given to the guards under this emergency legislation, so to help and support the kind of the health service, was directing a person to comply with the regulations, arresting an individual for failure to comply with directions, demanding a person's name and address. So if you were stopped at a road checkpoint or on the street by the guards, you'd have to give your name and address. Arresting someone for failure to comply with the demand for the name or address, and just arresting someone for failure to comply with the regulations. So needless to say, there was kind of an outcry, especially within the academic community, I think, about the fact that the power was primarily to arrest an individual. So that's, that was kind of the main introduction in the emergency legislation, and people perceived that to be quite extreme. Since then, in terms of the road checkpoints, they've been dispersed across the country, especially around the holiday weekends. You'll see guards kind of surround major arteries outside of cities and towns to kind of make sure that people are staying within the lockdown area. And there have been about 1,400 other incidences of kind of offenses when the guards have been stopping people at checkpoints. And those go from things like drink driving to drug use. What's interesting in Ireland, though, is that there are generally high levels of support for the police. You know, up until Ireland became a republic, there was a colonial police force. Now the police force is kind of within the self-governed republic. It has an independent oversight authority. So people tend to have quite high levels of support and trust for the police. Guards here who are on the front line don't carry guns. And I think that's a good example of how, as a post-colonial society, a small post-colonial society, that Ireland shows the perils of kind of extrapolating from the US or England as examples of what kind of policing structures look like. And there's actually a huge body of work that kind of speaks to this Hibernian exceptionalism to broader punitive trends. So in Ireland, there is a continued emphasis on rehabilitation and you know, looking after individuals, as opposed to kind of dominant cultures of control in relation to the police elsewhere. One of my colleagues had recently written a piece, kind of an op-ed, about, you know, the increased powers being a good opportunity for the Garda Síochána to further demonstrate their positive relations, let's say, with the community. So even though the new powers permit arrest of those who kind of leave their areas of residence, the guards have tried to adopt a policy that they're calling the 4 E's. So instead of jumping to arrest someone, they should engage, explain, and encourage individuals to stick to the guidelines before moving to the 4th E, which is enforcing the new powers. They do have a lot of discretion around kind of a reasonable excuse. So if you're caught outside of your home area, what is a reasonable excuse for you to have left your home area? There is concern about whether the powers are going to be kind of applied or used equitably or not. Will certain groups feel or actively be intimidated by high visibility controls? There have been issues with direct provision centers where asylum seekers tend to live in Ireland. And that's a whole other kind of can of worms in terms of thinking about human rights, of course. Also, the traveler community have felt like they've been discriminated against during the kind of crackdown with these new enforcement powers. So those are things to consider. In terms of thinking about surveillance, the police and the kind of surveillance structures are seemingly distinct but interrelated. So in terms of thinking about surveillance in Ireland at the moment and some kind of key concerns moving forward, there's 3 primary examples that I'm thinking of that kind of give us reason for concern. So the first is mass screening. So there have been examples of the health service employing mass screening at meat processing plants, nursing homes, and other kind of large workplaces over recent weeks. And at least one case, the employer was given the results of the COVID-19 testing before employees were notified of their results. So it was a journalistic agency that kind of came across this information, and then the Irish Health Service executives, said that this was bad practice. The Data Protection Commission has also condemned it as an illegitimate practice, but it did happen. It's also worth noting that a number of the staff who work in the meat processing plants and the nursing homes are migrant workers or individuals who might be living in direct provision centers. The next thing that, actually just was announced last night was the beginning of a more meticulous airport screening process. So beginning next week, all passengers coming to Ireland will legally be required to complete a passenger locator form. So they'll have to fill in a form up to 2 weeks before they arrive in Ireland. It will be emailed to them, and they have to provide a home address for where they intend to stay for the 14 days of their kind of mandatory self-isolation. It applies to people coming into ports because there are a lot of ferry services coming and going from Ireland, as well as airports. And they did say that penalties for not completing the passenger location form include fines of up to 2,500 euro. So, kind of far more than a month's wages for the average individual. The other big concern coming up or coming out over the past month or two, and is still an ongoing concern, is the COVID Tracker Ireland app. So as part of the national response, like every other country, there is this perception that technology will save us. And so there has been work to develop a national app for contact tracing and real-time symptom tracking. And this would enable, the health service to improve the speed and effectiveness of the contact tracing that they're already doing. And they say it's, to map and predict the spread of COVID-19 in support of the overall goal to flatten the curve. So the same kind of rhetoric as we're seeing, internationally. There's been much concern that a centralized database would be used. Ireland also has a history of having their central government databases breached. So I know, for me, this is a huge concern, of course. So a lot of academics and kind of engineers and privacy specialists have been advocating for a decentralized database for this app. It's still not clear as well if the app is being developed by the government in-house or if it's being contracted out to a third-party developer. There's no details about where data is going to be stored, who will have access to it, how it will be distributed, or how it will be acted upon. So we don't know if the Garda Síochána would have access to the data in that app, if they'd have access to follow up on the, the kind of passenger tracking forms. That's all kind of rather murky and unclear still. And so in many kind of letters to the government, the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, as well as kind of other privacy activists have kind of stated these concerns. I'm just trying to think what else I wanted to kind of mention. Another interesting thing I think in the conversation is that, Ireland still has a number of rural communities. I'm actually in a very rural area for lockdown in the kind of southwest of the country. I'm really glad that my Wi-Fi is working well. But, there are remote communities, rural communities, and they seem to be free from COVID-19. The highest rates of kind of cases are in Dublin and in the surrounding counties from Dublin. I mean, that's where most of the population is. So, there's kind of been a difference in terms of the measures applied to the different areas. I think when we think about surveillance, especially in the time of, a pandemic, I always like to pause and see, do we really need to use the technology in order to kind of address the concern or the issue? Will the technology that you're proposing actually help us in, stopping the spread? Who has access to it? All of these kind of data collection and privacy concerns aren't fully considered ahead of time for the most part. And if there is no sunset clause on the legislation, if it's unclear how long data is retained for, it's, we're just asking for trouble. Other tech kind of mundane things are that 28% of the population in Ireland doesn't have smartphones. So the technical limitations of these apps actually working are very real as well. So I know I'm over my time now, so I'm going to wrap up. But I just wanted to say that a colleague and I in Maynooth are actually going to launch a national survey on Monday for the Republic of Ireland to get a sense of people's support for, concerns about the various kind of technologies that are being proposed, their concerns about data, limitation, collection, and so forth. And so, you know, I'm really looking forward to hopefully sharing those results and get a sense of what people are thinking in a month or so. Thanks.
Thank you, Ciara. So I have a couple questions for you, and it's really interesting to hear the parallels between what's going on in different parts of the world. One of them was, how did you determine, or how are people determining how many enforcement actions there's been? Have the police been releasing those numbers, and do you know more information about them, demographics and that kind of thing? Yeah.
Okay. Will I answer that question or wait and
or you could go for it. You could go for that one, and then I'll give you.
Okay. So the independent oversight body, the police authority, have been collecting that data from the Garda Síochána. So they're taking count from the Garda Síochána's records. It's being shared with them, but it doesn't actually give details of the incident. So it just says time and place and whether it was related to the emergency measures. So the police authority are actually looking for more detail. So what exactly was the context of, you know, of that charge, of that offense, and so forth? Because right now that information is limited unless it comes out in a news story.
Okay. Interesting to see police oversight bodies actually trying to do police oversight.
Yeah.
Could you? One person asked if you could share the op-ed that you mentioned.
Yeah.
So, are there other forms of resistance in Ireland to the emergency measures, to forms of surveillance? Are there things that you think would be useful for other people to know that are happening kind of on the ground there?
I mean, that's a good question. So I'm originally Irish and I've lived in Canada. I mean, you can probably tell from my accent, for a number of years. And so I've just been back almost for 2 months before the pandemic. And I'm kind of readjusting to the general kind of zeitgeist, let's say, here. And my perception is that people are a lot less concerned about surveillance, security, policing measures than in Canada. I haven't really come across many cases of, you know, resistance to the powers. It seems to generally be the kind of academic or civil liberties groups who are speaking in response to the measures. There have been a few journalists who were wanting to challenge the measures in court, but they're from a separate group. They're kind of right-wing libertarians who are challenging it in a different way, let's say, than the Irish Council for Civil Liberties or the kind of privacy advocates and academics who are raising concerns. So no, not really, not yet anyway.
Okay. And one last question. Have concerns about police collaborations with public health been in the public at all in the past in Ireland, and has this kind of been a new issue? And sorry, where'd the rest of that question go? I guess just that. Oh wait, have the concerns about, prior to COVID, were there concerns in Ireland about the convergence of public health and police? Or is this kind of a new matter?
Yeah, I think it's a new matter. You know, like I said, there have been occasions in Ireland recently where new kind of government public initiatives around identity cards, for example, public services cards have come up. to kind of limit particular populations from accessing social welfare. A lot of it fed into kind of problematic public sentiment, I felt. But no, in particular, this kind of collaboration between An Garda Síochána and the health service is, new to the pandemic. And I think in terms of, limiting function creep and just limiting the powers, this is something that needs to come up, so that there is a sunset clause, so that this isn't something we need to continue worrying about when we go back into kind of, normal times, whatever that will mean.
Okay, one last question from Stephen, who's going to speak after you. Has COVID-19 guidance from the European Data Protection Board been helpful in your work or advocacy, or has it been part of the conversation at all in Ireland? And has there been any issues regarding coordination with the north of Ireland or between the Republic of Ireland and the UK responses?
Yeah, those are some good questions. In terms of the guidance, yes. So the health minister released a statement or made a statement to the Oireachtas, so the Irish House of Government, I think 2 weeks ago, and said that they were heeding, the EU directives and were taking up the kind of recommendations around contact tracing apps and so forth. And so they had said and committed to using a decentralized app and that sort of thing. So that seems very positive. In terms of the whole north-south divide, I mean, old habits die hard. I think it's really funny that this conversation about the Republic and the North has indeed come up again. So when Ireland went into lockdown before England and the UK did anything about COVID-19, a lot of people were, kind of yelling out for a one island strategy, which is exactly what we can't do because of, the Republic and the North having separate, distinct governments. There have been issues in the border counties because people have family on both sides, they're mobile, they do their groceries on one side and live on the other. They might work on one side of the border and their kids go to school somewhere else. It's all very kind of open. And it has posed problems. So for example, if somebody comes down from the north into the deep south of Ireland, let's say, so they've traveled like a substantial difference, the powers of the Garda Síochána don't apply to the individuals if they don't live in the Republic of Ireland. The rates of cases around border counties in the Republic have been higher, respectively or comparatively to other areas. So it's certainly, raised some interesting challenges, to say the least.
Cool. Thank you so much, Ciara. Nice to see your face
Alex.
too.
Yeah, you too.
If people have other questions for Ciara, just send them to me, and we can get to them at the end if there's time. So next, I'm going to pass it on to Stephen Meldrum, who's an interdisciplinary social scientist who studies sexual and gender minority health, health information technology policy, public health reuses of clinical HIV data, and the ethics of genomic epidemiology. I'll pass it over to Stephen. And Stephen, let me know when you want me to do my screen sharing for your...
You can go ahead and throw up the slides now, Alex. Thank you. And can everybody hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, you can go ahead and start the slides. Now I'm going to use slides for my presentation.
Okay, hold on.
So
here we go.
Awesome.
Let me get this working. So I just enlargen them like this.
Yeah, perfect. Cool. And I'll just say slide with advance. So, okay, cool. So hi, everyone, and thank you for being here today and for coming to this. As Alex said, my name's Stephen Meldrum. I'm a UC President's Postdoctoral Fellow in the University of California, Irvine Department of Anthropology. And for about 5 years, I've studied public health surveillance, HIV/AIDS, and health information technology policy in the United States, amongst other issues. And I'm also an activist with interests in sexual politics, labor, digital platforms, and also a kind of sort of all in the service of imagining new ways that of democratically governing health data infrastructures with the aims of giving individuals greater autonomy in medical decision making in their engagements with the health system, their clinicians, providers, public health, and researchers. And so I want to get started by saying thanks to the organizers of this really phenomenal series, particularly Alex McClelland and Colin Hastings, who had a lot to do with putting today together. And I also want to thank Mikiki, who I think is here with us, who is a Toronto-based queer artist, drag performer, and sexual health educator who has been making all of the gorgeous artwork for each one of these events. And Mikiki is working in a storied tradition of queer infectious disease advocates such as Greg Bordowitz, Zoe Leonard, Diamandagalas, and David Wojnarowicz, who generated new radical aesthetic paradigms to confront our community's most pressing health challenges, of course, through the AIDS crisis, but also before that, regarding pathologization of queer people and STIs and that sort of thing. So I just want to say thanks to Mikiki for all the aesthetic work that he's putting into this movement too. And I also want to thank, before I get started on my remarks, Alex again, and my colleague at UCI, Mustafa Hussain, who I've been working on with developing some of the language and the arguments that I will be putting forward today about how workers in the healthcare, health IT, and public health systems could potentially act to stop or to resist the implementation of COVID-19 data sharing protocols that have been established or which might be established between public health and police agencies, or perhaps the development of other COVID-19 related police technologies that aren't part of the ecosystem yet. Unfortunately, as I will describe, protocols and have been discussed, protocols of this sort have become a feature of the response in many jurisdictions. So slide. Cool. So in my remarks, I will argue that health data workers who are involved in the implementation of, I will argue that health data workers who are involved in the implementation of COVID-19 police data sharing protocols should feel empowered. Did you hit just the forward button?
Sorry, I don't know how to use the slide thing. Apologies.
It's okay.
There we go, right? Is this where you want?
There we go, cool. That is where we want to be. Great, thanks, Alex. So in my remarks, I will argue that health data workers who are involved in the implementation of COVID-19 police data sharing protocols should feel empowered to use their discretion and judgment, their professional discretion and judgment, to act and organize to prevent COVID-19 data from ending up in the hands of police. I will argue that by learning from the recent successes of the #TechWon'tBuildIt movement and related initiatives such as #NoTech4ICE or NoTech4ICE, we can see how individual and collective acts of refusal and workplace organizing by civically minded tech workers and data stewards can have a major impact on the direction of organizations' ethical orientation toward issues such as entering into contractual arrangements with police agencies and other arms of the private and public security apparatus. So I'm suggesting that this ethic could be brought to bear on COVID-19 police data sharing protocols to potentially interrupt flows of COVID-19 data from health agencies to police agencies, or to pursue reforms during the course of implementation. Slide. Many jurisdictions in the United, it's like if you hit the space bar, and then one more. And then you can hit the space bar or the arrow key. We can do it that way, sure. Maybe refresh the page, Alex. So many jurisdictions, just advance 2 slides. Great. Thank you. So many jurisdictions in the United States and Canada have established protocols for the routine sharing of identifiable COVID-19 data with police agencies. And so per the Associated Press, about 2/3 of US states have adopted such protocols. In Canada, Ontario has implemented a protocol that facilitates police access to individuals' COVID-19 status upon police requests from health data custodians, including public health officials and laboratories. So I want to emphasize that this is really highly abnormal. Okay, this is not a normal part of health data sharing in almost any other instance, including in other instances of pandemic emergencies. Slide. And so in the United States, Canada, and many other countries, sharing an individual's health data with police and law enforcement is generally considered inappropriate in the absence of specific individual consent to disclose the data or a court order. And this is, in addition to being normal best practice, this is also the position of groups as varied as the UN Joint Program on HIV/AIDS, the American Civil Liberties Union, Canadian Civil Liberties Association, digital rights groups like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and quasi-official entities like the European Data Protection Board and the American Medical Association in recently released privacy principles. Basically, health data should stay in the health system, and police are simply not a part of the health system. Unlike other first responders, such as firefighters and paramedics, law enforcement personnel do not provide healthcare or social services. Rather, they only function punitively and overwhelmingly, as we've been discussing as part of these conversations, harm marginalized communities, particularly people of color, LGBTQ people, the poor, and the unhoused. Police have no business with individuals' health data, even in situations of pandemic emergency, and history shows that sharing health data with law enforcement will do far more harm than good. The ignominious histories of HIV criminalization and the mismanagement of the opioid crisis through so-called war on drugs policies are both cases where the mismanagement of medical conditions through criminalization and coordination between police and public health has seriously and deeply, and in some cases irreparably, harmed affected communities. Slide. Just as we cannot police our way out of the pandemic with fines and punishment, we cannot police our way out of the pandemic by sharing identifiable COVID-19 data with law enforcement. Slide. Tech workers and stewards of COVID-19 data are in a unique position in this regard. As the builders of systems and custodians of data, they stand as the mediators between the health system and the police. This class of workers, this professional class of expert workers, is thus strongly positioned to use their professional judgment to contribute to resisting COVID-19 criminalization by potentially helping to ensure that COVID-19 data are not inappropriately shared with police if they so choose, such as, for example, through the execution of the protocols that have been in place now. Slide. So the last 2 years have really given rise to a renaissance in workplace organizing in the tech sector, with an emphasis generally on workers at big tech firms acting consciously and collectively to alter the direction of their employers' ethical decision-making processes. So in 2018 Facebook post, the group Tech Workers Coalition, which is based in the US, described #TechWon'tBuildIt as, quote, an open forum for tech workers concerned about the role of tech in border control, military, and surveillance, unquote. That specific action in 2018 was related to a campaign to get Amazon to cancel facial recognition projects with the firm Palantir, which was known to work with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, which is an agency well known for its many human rights abuses, such as maintaining concentration camps on the U.S.-Mexico border and detention centers throughout the U.S. The hashtag #NoTech4ICE has also been widely used in ongoing work to try and organize and convince an array of tech firms to cancel contracts with the agency. And I've been an observer of this. I've gone to several meetings, but this has been a discourse that's been driven by tech workers themselves almost exclusively. So since 2018, Tech Won't Build It has grown into many other areas and has become a burgeoning social movement, activating socially conscious workers in the tech sector and their allies in academia and adjacent industries to reshape the values of communities, of companies where they work, through individual acts of resistance and collective workplace organizing. Strategies have included personnel internally advocating at large firms through the introduction of fairness, accountability, and transparency initiatives, particularly regarding technologies such as facial recognition and AI. Tech workers taking part in organizing and protest outside the workplace, engaging in other forms of workplace organizing, circulating petitions, and staging mass walkouts. Issues that tech workers have acted on in this way include ICE contracts, of course, but also defense contracts, environmental issues, and other matters related to social justice and ethics in technology. In every instance of successful tech sector organizing, however, it took many individual actions, collective work, and a great deal of courage in the exercise of individual and group judgment by tech workers. It's often involved real risks of loss of employment, particularly for leaders of these movements, and some tech workers who have organized in this space have lost their jobs, often simply for doing the right thing or for raising legitimate ethical concerns. The 2018 Google walkouts, for example, which were led by someone named Meredith Whitaker, who's now at NYU, led to a number of firings and suppression of organizing at Google, and there have since been allegations that Google has targeted queer tech organizers within the organization. So all of this is to say that if tech workers and COVID-19 data stewards feel called to become engaged through acts of resistance to sharing COVID-19 data with police, if they decide to use their discretion in their professional discretion to engage in these forms of resistance and workplace organizing, they need to know that groups like Policing the Pandemic and others that focus on issues of disease criminalization, we can make it clear to these workers that they will have support and a kind of movement at their backs if they make these decisions. Next slide. So to conclude, I'm going to present 7 alternatives to sharing COVID-19 with law enforcement that health data stewards and health IT workers could potentially use to organize in their workplace, or they could organize around in their workplace if they so choose, and if their jurisdiction has decided to implement a COVID-19 police data sharing protocol. At the end, I also provide a list of organizations that could potentially be resources for workers organizing in this space, both tech workers and then COVID-19 health data custodians who might not be tech workers, but who might play a role in the execution of these protocols. For example, people who work in laboratories or health departments. So first, individuals in leadership roles at these organizations that can designate COVID-19 data as sensitive information or as public health surveillance data, and thus subject to similar restrictions on disclosures to law enforcement. So at least in the US, a sensitive designation akin to HIV surveillance data held by public health departments, or clinical data about HIV status, mental health, substance use, domestic violence, and other categories of sensitive health data often comes with extra safeguards and protections governing data disclosures and reuse, which often include the requirements for police and prosecutors to secure a court order before they can get the data. Secondly, organizations can implement segmented COVID-19 data interoperability with first responder agencies. And so a lot of these protocols, they lump police together with healthcare first responders, such as paramedics and firefighters. What I mean by implementing segmented COVID-19 data interoperability with first responders is that public health agencies could build data interoperability loops with public safety agencies that actually facilitate data sharing with healthcare first responders, such as paramedics, while preventing data sharing with police and other law enforcement agencies that do not have a health function. But how that would take place would be completely dependent on how the different ecology of organizations in that area are actually implementing the protocol. So these would all look very different depending on the actors at play. Thirdly, organizations could designate a panel to review applications from police for COVID-19 data rather than simply turning the data over. So an existing IRB or ethics review board at a health department could review applications from law enforcement to view COVID-19 data rather than simply making the data available to police. Community advisory boards that health departments maintain could also play a role in this. Fourth, individuals or groups of health data workers could simply decline to share COVID-19 data with police. And so stewards of COVID-19 data, if they choose to do this, should know that they're within their rights to consult legal counsel, chapters of civil rights groups in their jurisdiction, as well as their professional associations or unions. And in some healthcare organizations, there will be some sort of an ombudsman they can consult. So individual US health workers or associations of professionals who in the United States who object to sharing coronavirus data with police on moral grounds could consider appealing to newly introduced and passed federal conscience protections. And fifth, as a kind of extension of number 4, workers more on the technology side could decline to build COVID-19 data infrastructures that are interoperable with law enforcement. The sixth recommendation is workers could advocate internally for policies to limit COVID-19 data sharing. And seventh and finally, workers who believe that agencies are engaging in improper sharing of COVID-19 data can report improper data sharing and other abuses to internal, Office of Inspector Generals or to other appropriate authorities. So to wrap up, workers in this area and other stakeholders can also seek other means to share information about or to stop COVID-19 data abuses. And as Alex mentioned earlier, this has already occurred in Toronto. Slide. So in April, a message disclosing a person's COVID-19 positive status was sent across communication channels to operators of the Toronto Transit Commission. The message stated, quote, "Please do not pick up, female, black, redacted. Person is homeless and confirmed to be COVID-19 positive." A bus driver posted an image of the notification on Twitter. TCC later replied with an apology. It's unclear how the transit system secured access to the data. However, we can see here how this very small action by a humane and civically minded employee of the transit system was enough to instigate policy change. Slide. Finally, here's a list of organizations that COVID-19 data custodians and health workers can feel empowered to consult using their own professional judgment if they are considering an act of resistance, refusal, workplace organizing, or civil disobedience related to sharing COVID-19 data with police. I am not affiliated with any of these organizations, to be clear. I provide the list based on public statements made by these groups against COVID-19 data sharing with law enforcement agencies and or in support of tech worker organizing. So thank you very much, and solidarity.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for that. That was excellent, and appreciate you putting up with my lack of understanding of your slides. Okay.
Alex, you're fabulous.
I have a couple questions for you. So where are we here? What would you say to those who build surveillance software and feel uneasy about its implementation? How can activists connect to and support those who build tech and have those type of concerns?
So I think that the best, from my view, having been someone who has, in my research, I work with a lot of people who work in public health. I interview and try and understand the work of a lot of people who work with these different kinds of data and what their concerns are. And I will say that we oftentimes in the critical community, we tend to treat public health, I want to address the police. We tend to think about public health, or we can tend to fall into a tendency to think about it in this sort of flat way as like a monolithic institution. But there is a lot of internal dissent in the community here, and I can assure you that that in the process of implementing these protocols, there's a lot of internal dissent happening. However, if there is, and if it's not actually being borne out in conversation, and this is how health departments work. They get together and they have conversations about how to implement when they talk about these ethical issues. If someone, but in order to feel empowered to actually take action, I think what I'm trying to say in my talk is that groups like We Can't Police the Pandemic, folks who are working with community-based organizations and advocacy organizations need to kind of make it known that, like, if folks who are employed in these sectors use their professional judgment and their own professional ethical codes of conduct to resist what they think are unethical or amoral actions, they need to know that they're going to have support, and they need to know that there are going to be people that they can go to, if not for, that there are going to be movements at their back, and that there are resources potentially even within their own organization, such as if there's an ombudsman or some route of appeal, to act and not be acting alone. Worker power happens because of solidarity and shared action, and we need to make sure that folks who are thinking about conducting acts of resistance related to sharing COVID-19 data with police don't feel alone in doing so, because they're not alone in doing so. And so broadcasting that somehow would be important, because it's going to be up to them to make the decision based on their own professional judgment. But that's what I would say. I would say not pursuing a strategy of reaching out to people, reaching out to people to try and get them to do this, not at all. They need to use their professional judgment. But in doing so, they need to know that they're going to be supported by this social movement that we're creating.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Okay, that's it for questions for now, I think. If there are any more, just put them in the chat. Thank you, Stephen. So next, we're going to move on to Arun Kundani, author of Muslims Are Coming, Islamophobia, Extremism, and the Domestic War on Terror from Verso Books, and the former editor of the journal Race and Class. Arun, welcome.
Thank you, Alex. So yeah, thank you for inviting me to join this conversation. I'm not going to be giving you the kind of very kind of fine-grained, kind of detailed analysis that the three previous speakers have offered. So I hope what I have to say is useful. I'm kind of going to take a step back a bit, I guess, and try and think of this a bit more of a background level. And I'm coming at this very much from the point of view of someone who's been working around the issues thrown up by the war on terror over the last, well, too long. You know, what we saw around the immediate aftermath of 9/11 was a whole load of measures rolled out, presented as temporary emergency measures. I'm sure you're all aware of this. That then became permanent. We still have prisoners held at Guantanamo who've never been convicted of any crime. We still have around the world all the anti-terrorist legislation that was passed after 9/11 on the statute books, very few exceptions. We still have the authorization for use of military force that the US Congress passed in the days after 9/11 that authorizes the US military to treat the entire world as a battlefield. That's all still with us. 19 years later? So, when in the thinking back to that time, just after 9/11, those of us who had been active around civil liberties, about thinking about the racial criminalization of communities, in fact, the left broadly, kind of, we were caught napping, right? We kind of felt, I think, that this was such a, that this event had kind of thrown us, and we didn't really engage with what was happening very quickly after, and so authoritarian measures were possible to be brought in quite quickly without any kind of response. And, so my main concern is at the moment is that we are on our toes, and that we don't kind of think that we can kind of sit this one out, and in a few months or years, however long we imagine that period to be, that we can then kind of go back to what we were doing without anything being different. We need to act now. The agenda is pretty clear. The aim is to use the pandemic as a pretext to bring in all kinds of new measures, new practices that intensify the various kinds of discriminatory and authoritarian policing that we already have, it seems to me to remove from public space unruly populations, whether those are racialized groups, the poor, protesters, the indigenous, and so forth, right? And that seems to me the broad kind of agenda here. Now, those of us who've been thinking about the questions of national security around the war on terror, we've long argued that rather than thinking about what security means in terms of kind of reacting and responding to this kind of constant series of external threats that always get inflated and exaggerated, we should be thinking of security in terms of are we living with healthy social relationships with each other? And what's happening now is that rather than redefining security in terms of health, health is being redefined in terms of security, right? And what should be a public healthcare response is getting kind of folded into the nexus of national security, right? In countless ways. And in a way, that's part of why that's happening is because we've seen over the last few decades neoliberal states kind of shed their capacities for doing public healthcare and dramatically increase their capacities for policing and for military force. And so now when this pandemic comes along, it's those capacities that they've built up over the last couple of decades that they are deploying as central to their response, especially in the most neoliberalized parts of the world, like US and UK. It's like that old thing of if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and if you're a securitized neoliberal state, then everything looks like a security threat, even when it's actually a public healthcare problem. So but this is something that we're seeing across the world. So there are endless examples, I'm sure you're familiar with these, of how the pandemic is being used, for example, to actually increase the detention of migrants with all the kind of negative healthcare consequences that has, to increase the incarceration of racialized groups with all the negative healthcare consequences that has, you would expect perhaps that in this kind of situation of the pandemic that there would be some restrictions on freedom of movement, but what we're actually seeing is not restrictions on freedom of movement at borders driven by medical assessments, but actually an attempt to control the dispossessed rather than to control the pandemic. That's why refugee boats that turn up across the Mediterranean in Europe are being literally smashed up by European military patrols, leaving the passengers to certainly die, whereas private jets are actually quite free to still land in Europe from places outside Europe. So we should be very clear that what we're seeing here can't be justified by the medical needs to control the pandemic. So and then we also know that the kinds of kind of quarantine and shelter at home measures that are being imposed in many parts of the world, especially in the global south, are being imposed without any consideration for people's need for food, for water, for shelter, and so forth. And so what that is generating is protest, is movements of people wishing to who are basically saying that they refuse to stay at home and starve. We're seeing that in India, we're seeing that in South Africa, we're seeing that in to a certain extent in Latin America as well. So I think this is going to certainly be increasing over the coming months, and then those movements, essentially protest movements, are being met with militarized policing, water cannons, riot police, and so forth. Then you think of the globally the way that the pandemic is disproportionately affecting racialized groups. So, for example, in the United States, the data that we have so far says that African Americans are 3 times as likely to die as a result of COVID-19. In the UK, people of color are about twice as likely to die. And that's a kind of grim index of the kind of long-standing kind of racial inequalities in those countries. And we're going to see the same thing around the world in various ways, as well as the differences in different capacities of healthcare systems around the world to deal with this. Ruthie Gilmore, the scholar based at City University of New York, says that one way you can understand racism is as group differentiated vulnerability to premature death, right? Group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. And that's certainly a way of understanding racism that's become very much more pertinent at the present time. Frantz Fanon, the Martinican analyst and activist of colonialism, wrote that anti-colonial revolts occur when it becomes, for multiple reasons, impossible to breathe. And that sort of idea of "I can't breathe" became, I'm sure you know, became one of the slogans of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States after those were the last words of Eric Garner, who was choked to death by the New York Police Department. For me, that phrase of "I can't breathe" is now taking on a new layer of meaning as a kind of way of thinking about, who's going to have access to ventilators that are going to save lives and who's not. And so, I think we should be talking about the right to breathe in every sense, right? In terms of access to the kind of public healthcare resources that we need, but also the sense of being able to breathe in the sense of being free still to come together in public space. Because the thing about, obviously the thing about this, the virus is that it kind of harnesses our social relationships to spread itself, right? And so the terrifying thing that we're dealing with at the moment is that the thing that makes us most human, which is our connections with each other, and also the thing that enables us to be free, because it's our connections with each other that enables us to build social movements to defend our spaces of freedom, right? That is the thing that the virus harnesses and uses to spread itself. So we need to, I think this moment is about, the crucial thing is how do we think through how we can defend the use of public space for collective action, for social movements, for our kind of basic human need to come together as communities, as peoples, to fight for our freedoms, fight for our liberation, right? How can we do that? And there are it seems to me, I can imagine many different ways of doing that in safe ways. But that seems to me the kind of crucial thing that we need to hang on to right now. And we're going to have to do that in the face of these challenges around policing that that we've all been talking about. A friend of mine, the journalist Susie Day, has this line that is, "The revolution will not be quarantined," and it seems to me that's a great way of summing up where we're at. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arun. I wonder, in terms of a question, are there things we can learn from resistance to the war on terror, that resistance and movements to the measures during the war on terror that could be transferable to what's happening now?
Yeah, I think so. One area that we can think about, right, is connecting back to the very specific issues around, that Stephen was just talking about around sharing of information, right? So, which was a parallel issue in relation to the war on terror in Canada, in the United States, and the UK, in the sense that, one of the things that the war on terror sought to do was to absorb non-policing public agencies into the policing nexus, right? So, think about something like, in the UK, for example, like, the last 10 years or so, if you were a public sector worker, not working in law enforcement, right, not working in the police force, you might be a youth worker, you might be a teacher, you might be a doctor, you might be a mental health worker. You were by law obliged to everyone that you dealt with to consider whether they might be, to use the terminology, vulnerable to radicalization, right? Whether they were an extremist. And so this would be one of the ways that a kind of Islamophobic way of thinking was institutionalized in public services, and surveillance was institutionalized in this way. But it was possible to mobilize all of those categories of non-policing public workers to with the argument that, look, as a teacher, I operate according to a completely different set of professional norms from a police officer, right? Like, my job as a teacher is to empower my students, to help them grow intellectually and in every other way. Now, that implies a completely different set of interactions than the kind of mode of operation that a police officer has, right? So there was a need to be very resolute in saying, we can't allow there to be a blurring of the boundaries between the police and other the other public services. So there was a coalition building process that took place in the UK quite successfully over the last few years that was able to build a coalition between the Muslim communities who were primarily affected by these measures, professional organisations like the teachers' unions, like the healthcare workers and other groups, to basically say, not only do we oppose this policy, but we individually and collectively as organised workers refuse to cooperate with it, right? And very large numbers of people did refuse. And that, initially these kinds of policies were introduced informally, right, without legislative backing, because the legislation was considered, the way that Britain, the way that the British state likes to work is less overtly. It doesn't like to actually put out there what it's really doing so clearly. So it tried to do it informally, but because we organised that resistance, it was forced to make it law, so that it was a compulsory legal, statutory obligation on workers. But even then, it was possible to organise people to refuse to participate in it. And we kind of managed to defeat that policy, right? In that way, it's still on the statute books, but it's been so heavily opposed, actually at the in the actual spaces where the policy is meant to be applied, that it's kind of dead. So certainly there's very positive models there that we can refer to.
Cool, thank you so much for that. We're gonna move on to the next speaker. Other questions, please put them into the chat box and we'll get to them if we have time at the end. Thank you so much, Arun. I appreciate your words with us today. Next, I'm gonna hand it over to Lena Denzik, who is a reader at the School of Journalism, Media and Culture at Cardiff University in the UK, and a co-founder of the Data Justice Lab. She's published widely on digital media resistance and the politics of data, and is a principal investigator of the Data Justice Project. Welcome, Lena.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thanks for having me. I'm going to try also in the interest of time to keep this brief, in part because several of the points to make have been made by Ciara already, because a lot of the things that she mentioned are also happening in the UK where I'm based. And also I'll build a bit on what Arun already talked about in terms of the historical conditions that have facilitated a lot of the measures that we're seeing at the moment. I'll sort of, I think, just build on that by talking about sort of three interrelated areas that particularly pertain to the sort of advent of surveillance infrastructures and digital surveillance, which is sort of the kind of technological solutionism aspect, the normalization of surveillance and what I've described as sort of surveillance realism, and the displacement of public infrastructure. And it's just, I think, just to stress for these things, the reason I'm sort of talking about these three different areas is that it's just very important to sort of say that what we're seeing is an acceleration of developments that were already happening. Very much so in the UK, at least where I've looked at. So this idea of technological solutionism, for example, this idea that the only way out of lockdown is through surveillance and it's through technological solutions, is something that builds on a form of governance that has been emerging for quite some time. It's also linked, of course, to, in the UK, a massive government failure, and so in terms of managing this pandemic, and so technological solutionism also emerges out of that. But I think the idea of mass data collection and using that for governance, and particularly in relation to what Arun also said in terms of the securitization of the state and of health, is very much comes out of ongoing use of digital technologies for assessing risk in all kinds of ways, including very much in public services, in welfare provision, also for children, child welfare, etc. And this now is the crisis that we're seeing now is being used to really advance the further scaling of a risk assessment under the banner of health. So the companies that are entering or embedding themselves within the public sector, within public institutions, are companies that were already selling their technologies as risk assessment tools. So we know that at local level, there's contracting happening now with companies like Experian, with companies like Centura, who are already embedded within the public sector in the UK for these types of risk assessments to do with the risk of child abuse and various other aspects that are based around sort of predictive analytics. They are now saying that they can further their services with also determining at risk, widely speaking, out of a result of the current pandemic. And of course, we're also seeing the sort of advent of things like immunity passport, which is another way of sort of categorizing and doing this kind of risk scoring for citizens and populations. And it's based on the same logic around using very reductive abstracted data to try and make an assessment about an individual. And what we have looked at this kind of trend before in our research, and obviously this is prone to lots of harms and errors, etc. And in many cases, this stuff doesn't actually work very well, but what it does do is push through an agenda where responsibility for social ills and social problems is pushed onto individuals. So risk factors are often attributed to individual characteristics and behaviors, and this is then also who will bear the burden of managing that risk. And this is really furthering this logic now under this under the current crisis, that it will be individuals. It is not clear what it means once you are assessed as being at risk in this context, what kind of support is actually in place to deal with that. And this will probably be up to individuals. And the responses will be targeted at individuals. So in many ways, these technological tools are trying to define problems in a very particular way that leads to social harm. The other aspect just is this normalization of surveillance and this kind of surveillance realism, where there is this active disempowering of people to think that there is no other way. There is no other way in which we can get out of our current state of affairs. And again, of course, this was already in place. I did some research around this after the Snowden leaks, where already this sentiment was pretty prevalent amongst people. And alternative ways of thinking about how to manage social ills were actively marginalized, and surveillance was seen as provided as the only solution. But I think what's happening at the moment, what's perhaps a bit different about the way surveillance is being normalized in this context, is the avenues through which it's happening. Because it's so intimately linked to the economy, and surveillance is seen as the only way in which the economy can be opened up, it's happening, I think, more through sort of workplace surveillance. And the workplace is becoming, which was already obviously a very surveilled place for huge parts of the population, but now this workplace surveillance is taking on further sort of policing significance, in that this will now include much more health and safety type surveillance, and will be these kind of things like immunity passports and contact tracing apps will be the only way in which you can be allowed to go back to work, and it will be hugely monitored. And of course, there's an obvious risk there of function creep, and what will employers do with this kind of data, etc. And also, this will only become more pertinent as we move more work online. And much of the work that's been moved online during this crisis will probably stay online. And there's also a key issue here where, I mean, I know that unions in the UK are really are the ones pushing also to ensure that there isn't then health data shared with law enforcement or with immigration, the immigration office by employers, right? And that there is a secure firewall here, which is there's a real danger that this might happen. But I think because there is such an active normalization of surveillance, one of the issues that we are confronted with in this context from a sort of resistance point of view is that a lot of efforts will be on mitigating the excessive harms of this kind of surveillance, rather than necessarily questioning how we are organizing our workplace and what it is appropriate to do with people at the workplace. Because of course, this surveillance, once it starts being about health, doesn't end at the workplace. Employers will now then have access to data about all kinds of things we do in our private lives as well, if they are going to use things like contact tracing apps or immunity passports. And so I think, you know, there is what we have to be careful about is that bigger questions about how we organize society differently or how we might think about work differently will be marginalized if we only focus on, if we accept that we have to have surveillance in order for the economy to open up. Our efforts will predominantly then lie in simply mitigating the excessive harms of that. And that links then to the third point that I wanted to make, which is, you know, a point that is being stressed a lot by a colleague called Ciara Bracken-Roche, who is at Delft University, who has really tried to sort of also shift the conversation towards the way in which these technology companies are embedding themselves within institutions and public infrastructure in such a way that really hollows out public infrastructure and displaces public infrastructure. And so this is a kind of, you know, talks about sort of infrastructural power that I think we lose sight of if we think that the issue is entirely on data collection and surveillance, because actually what we see, for example, in the UK is that the NHS is engaging in deals with companies like Palantir and Google and Microsoft, faculty and Amazon to set up a data store that's actually going to transform how the NHS is run and is going to change organizational practices in such a way that they become dependent on this technology infrastructure. At the moment, there's a lot of, we don't know exactly what is happening in terms of this deal. It's a lot of complete lack of transparency. It wasn't out for public tender, anything like this. But the problem is that this goes beyond privatization as we've normally thought about it. This isn't just about outsourcing. This is actually about displacing public infrastructure and making it over time dependent on this technology infrastructure in such a way that it becomes impossible to get out of this partnership. And so you see these kinds of public institutions getting locked into these this technological infrastructure that is essentially dependent on mass surveillance. And again, here there's also a question about trust, I think, that needs to be discussed, and perceptions about what this will do, because you know, there was a recent survey amongst that carried out by the everyone.org as an organization about public attitudes towards technology companies, and only something like 19% of the British population believe that technology companies design systems in the interest of the public. And so when you start embedding these companies within public institutions, and particularly something like the NHS, there's a question about how people will start engaging with those public institutions, and particularly how different parts of the population will receive of these kinds of partnerships, especially if you're going to contract with a company like Palantir. And so what we need to think about is also how there is going to be harm simply through the perceptions of the role of these technology companies, and whether this will deter certain communities from seeking healthcare. And again, also there is an ongoing concern about the transfer of data between health services and immigration authorities when these partnerships are set up. And this is not new in the UK. There have been campaigns before that actually successfully stopped the data sharing that was happening between the NHS and immigration authorities. But once, you know, the power lies elsewhere, once this power then lies with these technology companies, it will be very difficult to have proper oversight on these kinds of data sharing arrangements. I think just the issue is also that, of course, with these contracts, just is that this will stay in place after the pandemic, and will really override a lot of digital strategies, also within Europe, and the emphasis on data protection, etc. All of these things are being overridden by what's happening at the moment. So this is a massive challenge, I think, and probably where we should be focusing also more of our attention. Okay, I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lena. That was great. So I have two questions for you, or people have two questions for you. So in the context of COVID-19, there's been kind of, in certain parts of the world, mobilization about identifying alternatives to policing. And are there alternatives to technological solutions to public health risks, like contact tracing and stuff, that we could be mobilizing as well, or engaging with, that we haven't?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not an expert on health crisis, so I don't know exactly what solutions are appropriate, but I think it's become very clear that human contact tracing, as it were, seems to be much more successful than these technological solutions. That seems to be what is coming out in where these contact tracing apps have been used, that actually it comes from people engaging and explaining, understanding risk and communicating with each other, rather than necessarily some app that tells you are now at risk and people don't actually know what to do about that. So I think these solutions are being inserted on false premise. In the context of the UK, even more so, because it's not backed up by any of the other non-technical things that we need to be doing, like non-technological things like testing and these kinds of things that would be absolutely essential for anything like a contact tracing app to even remotely work. Also, it's not backed up by public trust. It's very clear most people won't download this kind of app. So it's also there, and therefore it won't work. Of course, if workplaces start making it conditional on being able to go back to work, that might change, but that's introduces so many other problems around discrimination and so forth as well.
Okay. Cool, thank you. And a question from Ciara: how can we counter the dominant discourse of technological solutionism so we don't end up in a defensive position of harm mitigation all the time when it comes to surveillance?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is difficult, but I think it's where you start, how you enter into the debate. So one of the things that we've talked a lot about the Justice Lab and things is actually you start from speaking to communities about what actual social and human needs are, and then you might insert technology around that. Whereas what happens with technological solutionism, of course, is that there is a problem already defined, already set, that therefore has a technological solution. So I think by sort of reversing the starting point and thinking about what are human needs, what are social needs, what are community needs, what are, I mean, I think Arun referred to sort of human security as a way of thinking about security, that would be the starting point, rather than necessarily thinking that technology needs to have a role. But I think this is really hard. I mean, one of the things that we have tried to do as well, a lot of work on, is that at the moment, a lot of these debates are being dominated by people who have an explicit interest in technology and in tech justice, if you like, technology justice. And one of the issues is that we are still struggling to engage, I think, with groups and movements who come from a different angle, who may therefore understand issues as being of a different kind. And there's still, I think, a lot of work to do in order to do that. But I think actually what's happening around work movements and the role of unions, I mean, again, I speak from the perspective of the UK, there's some interesting things happening there where we're getting a different way of thinking about some of the kind of technological solutions being proposed that take a different starting point, that aren't necessarily about digital rights or issues like that, but are actually about, say, workers' rights and anti-discrimination issues.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today. So in interest of time, we're going to move on. And our last speaker is Thato Masiangoako. Sorry if I pronounced your last name wrong, Thato. Researcher at the Socioeconomic Rights Institute of South Africa and member of the Anti-Repression Working Group of the COVID-19 People's Coalition in South Africa. I'm so excited you could join us. I've been watching your work. So I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Alex. I don't know if you guys can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Can you hear me fine? Okay, thank you. And
can
thank
hear you
you so
fine.
much to, perfect, thanks. Thanks to Aziz, actually, who extended this invitation to us. Really grateful, and we're glad to share some of our experiences and some of the work we've been doing. What happened in South Africa is that we've basically seen a lockdown which has been described as a toxic lockdown culture, and this was from Georgia Gagnon, from the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And so South Africa has formed part of this cluster of countries that have essentially decided to take an overly militarized and securitized response to what is a public health crisis. And so just a little background to our timeline. We essentially had our first case on the 5th of March, and 10 days later, the president announced the national state of disaster in terms of the Disaster Management Act, which allowed the government to essentially develop a coordinated and integrated response to the crisis. And so various ministries are represented on the National Coronavirus Command Council, including the Defense and Police Ministry, as well as Transport and others. And then on the 23rd, the president said that we'd actually have a national lockdown. And this was the most extreme form of confinement, essentially, because what we've now seen is a gradual easing of those restrictions. And so that was level 5, and we're going to work our way down to level 1. But under level 5, essentially, everyone was confined to their homes, and people could only leave their homes for the purposes of working, if you're an essential worker, and if you're getting groceries, visiting a doctor, or getting medication. And so the concern was, as soon as that was announced, was, what would this lockdown look like? And what was made clear was that the South African Police Service would be tasked with enforcing and implementing the regulations that would be released, and that the South African National Defence Force would be deployed in support of the police service. And, given our history with police violence, it comes as no surprise that the entire country was quite concerned with what this would mean. And what we saw during that time was essentially a lack of clarity in terms of what they would be allowed to do, because what we'd have was the NCC regularly issuing the various regulations and directions. So limitations on how many people could be traveling on public transport, time frames in which people could be moving around, and that sort of thing. But the police and military did not indicate, a clear set of guidelines according to which they'd be enforcing and implementing the regulations. But I just want to quote the president when he deployed the SANDF as well as the police service. What he said on the 26th, which was the day before the lockdown would commence, was that I expect you, he was speaking and I'm quoting, I expect you to implement this 21-day lockdown, and to do so with compassion, to do so with a great understanding, and to do so with respect for the people of our country, to do so with humility as well. And he went on to say that this is not a scope and donor moment, which essentially means this is not a kick and assault moment. And this is not a skit and donor moment, which means this is not a shoot and assault moment. This is a moment where we save lives. But 4 days into the lockdown, with 1,326 confirmed coronavirus cases and 3 deaths from the virus, there were also reports that at least 3 people had died as a result of excessive use of force by the security forces. And so there was a lot of criticism that was leveled against the Minister of Police, the NCC, SANDF, as well as the President, because what was also made clear by the Minister of Police is that community policing forums and community leaders would not be included in facilitating the police's management and implementation of the lockdown. But fast forward to today, our current cases, our confirmed coronavirus cases are 20,125, and we have 397 deaths. And many people who have been unpacking South Africa's response to the lockdown globally have lauded South Africa for seemingly getting on top of the virus. But of course, this has come at a huge cost in terms of, having a police service and a military force, unleashed onto people without the sufficient preparation that was necessary for what this moment would have required. And so the kinds of abuses that we saw right from the beginning to date have essentially ranged on a continuum, ranging from, the less serious, humiliating and unwarranted forms of punishment, ranging all the way to excessive and unlawful use of force, resulting in grave injuries and tragic loss of life. And what we've seen as well is that the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, who has been reporting to Parliament, they're the oversight body, the police oversight body in South Africa. What they reported to Parliament was that between the 26th of March and the 5th of May, they had received 828 complaints against the police. They're tasked with investigating complaints against the police only. And of that 828 complaints, only 376 were specifically lockdown related. A breakdown of that 376 figure is essentially 10 deaths that they're investigating, deaths that are a result of police action, 79 complaints relating to a discharge of an official firearm, 5 complaints of torture, 280 of assault, and 7 of corruption. And what civil society has basically done, in the days leading up to the official lockdown, the People's Coalition, the C19 People's Coalition was formed, and it sort of organically grew and organized in as democratic as possible a fashion. And we've been meeting virtually almost every other day. And so of that coalition, what has been established are working groups. And I am operating in the working group on anti-repression specifically. This working group specifically decided very early on that it would be important to get monitors out onto the streets in order to monitor the conduct of the security forces in enforcing the lockdown, as a way of preventing further abuses, but also as a way of accurately documenting and gathering evidence in the event of serious abuses and misconduct. And so about 400 monitors thereabouts have been deployed across the country in terms of the South African Human Rights Commission's framework. They have a piece of legislation in place that has allowed for them to extend accreditation to NGO bodies and individuals who are willing and able to go out and monitor what's going on. And what we've also done is establish a reporting platform that members of the public can report abuses on. And what the working group also did quite early on was, put out a press statement condemning a militarized and securitized response. We wrote a letter to the president, sort of, denouncing these abuses, but also noting what was emerging as a trend, is the forced removal of homeless people and essentially shipping them into camps, as well as the forced eviction of many people who live in informal settlements. And so what you were having, or what we were seeing at least, was a use of the security forces to further abuses against communities who have either been seen as problematic in the past, using this lockdown as a way to sort of further those agendas, so rendering people homeless through the forced evictions, in a clamping down on informal settlements, and arguing that people are using the lockdown to sort of invade land. But at the same time, rounding up homeless people and subjecting them to various processes and checks without their consent, essentially. And the latest developments in that is that that camp has been ordered to be closed. But, at least in the city of Cape Town, what they did in that camp, the Strandfontein camp, was they just dumped people under a bridge, at least 2 nights ago. And they have not been careful in terms of seeing how the camp could be closed down. So they were not, implementing a gradual closing down of the camp, because apparently someone in the camp had contracted COVID-19. But the people in the camp had to really argue for tests. And so that's just one example. But essentially the abuses that we've been seeing, there are a range of reasons, and they are both historical and contemporary. Some of these include, statements from leadership, statements by the Minister of Defense and the Minister of Police, which has sort of given out like a tacit kind of messaging. Unaddressed systematic patterns of misuse of force, as well as endemic lack of accountability. What South Africa has is, unfortunately, a catalog and an archive of really high profile incidents of state violence, for which no one has really been held accountable for. One of those would be, the Marikana massacre in 2012, for which none of the police officers who were involved in the shooting of the miners on that final day have ever been brought to book. I know some have been charged for the deaths that were in the lead up, for I think one of the miners who were killed. But essentially what we have is a police force who has never been held accountable for like an abuse on that kind of a scale. Another reason, and I think this has come up in the other presentations, has been, a usurpation of a public health agenda by a securitized, militarized, and anti-crime agenda. And another issue has obviously been, a grave lack of preparation, and all of these reasons have sort of been highlighted in quite a spectacular way in this case that I'm about to tell you about quite quickly. But essentially, what happened was on the Easter weekend, Good Friday it was, 10th of April, a gentleman by the name of Collins Khosa was brutally assaulted by members of the military. And he was accompanied by Johannesburg Metro. They were accompanied by members of the Johannesburg Metro Police. And essentially, what happened was they were patrolling and enforcing the lockdown in the township of Alexandra. And they came past his house and saw a camp chair in his yard and a cup of beer that was half consumed. And so they went into the home, and in the home was Mr. Khosa, his pregnant sister, his brother-in-law, and his own partner. And they essentially proceeded to, ask him about the camp chair and the half-consumed beer that was in the yard. And a confrontation ensued because obviously he objected to there being a violation of the lockdown regulations, which was what they were accusing him of having done, essentially. And he indicated that, drinking beer in my yard would not be a lockdown violation. But essentially what happened was they raided the home and they only found like another can of beer in the fridge. They proceeded to order Mr. Khosa and his brother-in-law outside of the yard. They poured the beer over their heads. And then they proceeded to assault him. And the military, according to a document that we've seen, the military are out policing this pandemic armed with R4 rifles. And so they hit him with the butt of that rifle, I think in the abdomen and I think in the head. They slammed him against the cement wall. And what happened, unfortunately, is that Mr. Khosa succumbed to the injury sustained in that attack. And so that matter was taken up by a private law firm, taken to the South African High Court on an urgent basis. And the Socioeconomic Rights Institute intervened as amicus because of our experience with past abuses like this, and our concern for what this case can do in holding the security forces accountable going forward. And so in a 79-page judgment that was handed down on the 15th of May, the judge found in favor of the Khosa family and ordered a number of things. He essentially granted all of the relief that the family sought, which was that all of the members of the military and the members of the Metro Police who were present at the incident be immediately suspended. What we had was that they were allowed to continue working and continue to police and implement the lockdown, even though they had this hanging over their heads. Another thing that was ordered was that the military and SAPS develop and publish a code of conduct and operational procedure, which is something that we've been calling for. And they were asked to also widely publicize these guidelines. Another thing that they've been asked to do is to establish a freely accessible mechanism for members of the public to report abuses, and that they should ensure that any internal investigations into the treatment of Mr. Khosa and other people who have had their rights infringed upon during this time be reported to the High Court. And so in line with this judgment, yesterday and today, I believe, the South African Police Service have issued guidelines, which I understand fall short of other documents that have been developed around the use of force. But that, in comparison to the SANDF document, is significantly better, because the SANDF document, I mean, there's been a lot of comments on social media about it, but it's a really, really chilling document. It essentially does very little to understand the context in which the military are supposed to be deployed in, and goes through like a list of scenarios in which SANDF members would be expected to do something and not do something. And some of those examples, I just want to read some of them. It's quite a spectacular document, honestly, and reflects a failure on the part of the military and leadership in general to fully take responsibility for the duty that they have to respect and uphold the rights of the South African public, and to also exercise the use of force as minimally and as reasonably as possible, in line with international standards of necessity, proportionality, legality, and exercising absolute precaution. What we're seeing is, it's quite disappointing, but essentially the document goes through, and it's a confidential document, but it's circulating on social media anyway. It goes through a list of scenarios. One is looting or public disturbance. The second scenario is drinking in one's yard, which is essentially coming from the Khosa incident in which this gentleman died. Another scenario is provocation and insult. Another scenario is roadblock. So there's very little emphasis. I mean, when I heard the Irish response to the lockdown, that is something that our security forces could definitely learn a great deal from. The idea that the security forces, at least in terms of supporting a public health response to COVID-19, they should be engaging, educating, and communicating with members of the public, because at least in the beginning of the lockdown, and what has, I think, been discussed at length is the inequality that exists in this country, and the extent to which social distancing or physical distancing is really possible in contexts where people are living in informal settlements where it's really difficult to social distance, but also where members of the public have often been found to not be violating any regulations, but the military and the police have essentially, you know, taken it upon themselves to enforce in very arbitrary and inconsistent ways. So yeah, I don't know how I'm doing for time. I think what I would perhaps just add, and maybe we can discuss further in the Q&A if there's any time, is the difference in response from the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Police, and the difference in response to other ministries. I know the Minister of Justice released that, you know, at least 19,000 inmates would benefit from being able to be put on parole in order to decrease overcrowding in prisons. I mean, that's one example of really progressive measures that are taken to deal with the lockdown for the purposes of curbing the spread of COVID-19. But the police, on the other hand, have gone the opposite route in terms of, you know, almost celebrating, you know, the number of arrests. I mean, at least as far, according to the minister's press briefing yesterday, at least 230,000 people have been found in contravention of lockdown regulations. And these include liquor-related offenses, cigarette offenses, which, by the way, have been heavily criticized, you know, banning of the sale of liquor or cigarettes. A lot of people have argued that, you know, this is not strictly related to curbing the spread of COVID-19, but of course, that's what we've seen when, you know, the Minister of Police has essentially, you know, taken lead from what we've seen in developing a government response to the lockdown. Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Thato. Since we're recording this, I mean, if you have the time, it would be great to just continue talking for a little while, because we can learn so much from what you're doing.
Okay.
So first of all, thank you for sharing those anecdotes. Really awful to hear, but also really powerful to see how much mobilization there's been. So two questions kind of to get us going are, was there an escalation of violence over time with the lockdown, or was it kind of immediate, like police violence? Was it kind of immediate? Is it just an ongoing thing, I guess?
So I think it's important to note that, you know, this kind of violence is not new in South Africa, and the violence that we're seeing is really, you know, very old patterns of relying on excessive use of force that are essentially, you know, being laid bare in quite a spectacular way when people are locked into their houses and is being put under the spotlight through the use of social media and the spectacular media reporting that we've had during the lockdown. But there was not an escalation slowly over time. I mean, literally on the very first day, there was a report that someone was killed. I think either a day later or a couple days later, another person was reported to have been killed. And in fact, that first person who had been killed, what happened in that incident, I think, is that it was a gentleman in Cape Town. He was assaulted by the police, allegedly tasered, and he died later on. And the IPID, the police oversight body, investigated and quickly came to the conclusion that he died of natural causes because it was a heart attack. And that was something that the Minister of Police ran with to the bank, essentially saying, you know, people are saying that the police have killed people, but that man, you know, died of natural causes. And that has been very harmful because, you know, a lot of reporting afterwards has essentially put pressure on IPID to sort of look at that case a little more carefully. And what they have agreed to do, at least from what we understand, is that they've agreed to re-look at that matter because their investigation does not take into consideration the abuse that man was subjected to just before he suffered that heart attack. So yeah, to answer the question, yeah, there wasn't an escalation, but I don't know if it's too premature to say there may be a decline because another civil society response has been that, public interest litigating firms established a hotline from the very first day of the lockdown, and people have been calling in, reporting any lockdown related complaints. And from the data that's coming through there, it seems that the greatest complaints and concern at the moment are around evictions, as people have lost their income and ability to pay their rent, and complaints around abuses are sort of dwindling, but they haven't completely gone away, and there may be a range of reasons for that.
Okay, thank you. It's interesting, the parallels. We've seen so many encampments of homeless people be taken down by police in Canada as well, because people aren't staying in the shelter system. So there's been these growing encampments in certain communities that the police keep taking down, and it's really awful. They bulldozed one in Toronto the other day. Can you talk about, because I think this is really inspiring, can you talk about the origins of the People's Coalition, how you formed, how you're organized, and like the fact that you have 400 monitors is really amazing. So can you talk about a little bit more about the structure of your work and how it all came about and who's involved?
Sure. So the People's Coalition was started by an organization called Chisimani. And they, I think, had like a mass meeting in the days after either when the president had announced the national state of disaster or something like that. But it was pretty close to that time. And essentially, I think what we're sitting at now is well over 250 organizations ranging in background, who have basically come together. So the groups that are represented are community-based organizations, social movements, informal workers organizations, trade unions, national and provincial NGOs, community health workers, public interest litigating firms, academics, experts, and any concerned individual. And we've been organizing virtually. The various working groups have been established, and an overseeing body sort of ties that together. So it's really a democratic and decentralized structure that is horizontally organized and held together by this overarching, I forget what it's called actually. I think it's a task team or something. But there's one of the working groups are, the anti-repression working group. There's one specifically around food security. There's one around gender-based violence. There's another one, I think, around education, labor. There's a media one. And so how we've been communicating is on WhatsApp, and we've been meeting on Zoom. And, we hold these virtual meetings regularly. Each working group, decides, how they meet and how often they need to meet and what they need to do, because we're responding to changing regulations that are I think in the beginning of the lockdown, the regulations were changing quite rapidly. So there's a legal team for that has sort of tried to advise the National Command Council, and so various submissions were made to amend and support the existing regulations that were issued. And one of the biggest victories that came out, at least in the early days of the lockdown and in the lead up to the lockdown, was a call for a moratorium on all evictions. Unfortunately, and this was granted, the Minister of Justice came out and said, all evictions during the lockdown would not be allowed. But what we've seen is, local governments essentially carry out evictions in spite of these directives. And so, vulnerable communities have almost found themselves, very, very helpless. I know so we represent a client group based in KZN, who have been on the receiving end of, violence from local government for a very long time. And we try to oppose an eviction because they were on the receiving end of very violent evictions. And that was not successful. However, in other parts of the country, judges have been a little more progressive. What was quite disappointing in the Durban matter was that, you know, the judge found that, you know, we could not prove that people were living there, but, you know, in informal settlements in which, you know, private security come in, break down an informal structure and burn any belongings that are there, you know, what kind of evidence can you provide for someone having lived there, you know, even though there's pictures of a bed and this, that, and the other thing. So yeah, I think those are some of that's how we've been organized. And it's also important to note that, you know, the People's Coalition has come together and represents a large part of civil society, but a lot of work is happening outside of that space as well. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Aziz had a question for you, a little bit more about the People's Coalition as well. But does the work of the People's Coalition draw explicitly from experiences of grassroots organizing around HIV and AIDS?
Yeah, that's an important question. I think some comrades who were involved in that in the TAC movement are in some ways involved in the People's Coalition, because you know, the TAC morphed into various other organizations. So I imagine that a lot of the comrades that were involved in that movement are involved in the work of the coalition currently, and we're learning from them.
Okay. Thank you for that, Thato. I guess I think people are having to leave now, so we've gone a bit over time, but thank you so much for sharing the work of the coalition with us, and it's really inspiring work. Someone posted that you're hosting People's Assembly against the Coassa case on Tuesday. Is there a way that people can access that?
Sure. So we'll circulate that invitation on our social media. We're going to host that on Tuesday, and I think we have capacity to host at least 500 people, or at least maximum 500 people, and that panel will include an attorney representing the family. Sari, who acted as amicus, will be represented on the panel. A constitutional issues expert will also be represented on the panel. A journalist who's been following the story very closely and has been in communication with the family will also be on the panel. And then another person who has organized mainly in Cape Town and has experience of previous military deployments in Cape Town, and has a close and tight understanding of community organization in Cape Town will also be on the panel. So what we're hoping to do is unpack what the judgment means for civil society, because as I mentioned, you know, there are various orders that were issued, and what we're seeing, at least in terms of the SANDF and SAP's response, SANDF did in line with the order suspend for members, but you know, those guidelines that they've issued are terrible, to say the least. And so we as civil society need to think about how we can use the judgment to really call for a reorientation of the security force response to the lockdown, and call for government to reassess how they manage the pandemic in South Africa.
Thank you, Thato. Very exceptional resistance work happening in South Africa, so thank you for sharing with us. So I wanted to say thank you to everyone for joining today. Thank you to all of our speakers, to Yavar, Ciara, Stephen, Arun, Lena, and Thato. Thank you to Aziz and Kat, Colin, and Jane for helping organize. We'll keep people posted about our next dialogue, which will be in about a month, and this will be posted online soon. Be well, stay safe, and much love and respect to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alex,
for having
the other
us.
organizers.
Thank you.
Thank you.